Congratulations on completing your second speech for the class, the informative speech, or Sierra College TED Talk, as I like to call it. Now, because this class moves quickly, we are going to jump right to the next one and start talking about persuasive speaking. So let's get started. This week, we're going to focus on persuasive speaking fundamentals. In other words, the goals of a persuasive speech and the types of persuasive speeches. We will then talk about ethics, or public speaking ethical considerations. Next week, we will dive even deeper into persuasive speaking and talk about persuasive appeals. But before we get started, let's take just a moment to go over the speech requirements for your third persuasive speech. Your third speech for this class takes the form of a persuasive speech. Your job will ultimately be to argue on behalf of your position on a particular issue. For example, maybe you want us to donate money to save the whales, or open up an animal shelter in Rockland, California. Maybe you want us to spend time donating or volunteering at the Sierra College Food Pantry. The choice is yours. It can be one where you focus on a local issue, a political topic, an environmental context, or one with philanthropic goals. Ultimately, the choice is yours. The requirements for this speech are that it is 5 to 7 minutes long. The speech is worth 100 points, and for it, you must submit one written outline. Remember, each bullet point should be limited to one full sentence. The outline should be typed and include 3 outside academic sources that you cite via in-text citation and list in the reference page. For this speech, you are also required to show one presentation enhancer. For more information and directions on this speech requirement, please take a look at the syllabus or the speech assignment packet. So, there's this saying in communication studies that all communication is inherently persuasive. Let me give you an example. If I were to see you in Starbucks today and say, "Gosh, I am really thirsty," you would most likely accept my claim as true. In fact, anytime I've told someone I was hungry or thirsty, I've never had them respond by saying, "No, you're not." In this way, couldn't we argue that anytime we communicate, we are essentially trying to get someone, in this case our audience, to accept our message at face value? Perhaps. If that's the case, then we can think about the goals of persuasion as narrowed down in 2 specific ways. Ultimately, a speaker makes efforts to shape, change, or reinforce someone's mind or their actions. So let's pause here and take a look at the differences between these goals. First of all, imagine that your goal was to shape someone's mind or behavior. What does shaping someone's mind or behavior assume? Well, ultimately, it assumes that the person or audience you're speaking to has little to no prior working knowledge of a particular topic. In this way, you are the first voice shaping their mind or their actions around this thing. Let's say, for example, that your goal was to persuade me to give you money in support of endangered species, and that the endangered species you were focused on saving was the North Atlantic right whale. Now, I might be ignorant and I apologize, but it would probably be safe to assume that I have very little knowledge of the North Atlantic right whale. I couldn't tell you how many are in existence, how their natural habitat is affected by pollution, or what I should do in order to save them. Therefore, I would assume as an audience member that most of the claims you were making about this species were in fact true. Of course, pending that you provide evidence to support your claims. If you gave this speech, you would be teaching me, shaping my mind, and therefore actions about this subject. Now, to change someone's mind or behavior is slightly more difficult. In fact, I cannot remember the last time I woke up in the morning and said, you know what? Today will be the day I change what I believe. In fact, most people are pretty committed to their beliefs, values, and even their routines. Let's say, for example, that I only work out 1 day a week. That's sadly true. And you want to give a persuasive speech convincing me that I need to change my routine and that working out 5 times a week is what's best for the human body. Now, what types of persuasive skills would you need to employ in order to actually get me to change my day-to-day routine? How challenging might that be as a speaker? Now, my goal is not to scare you off from changing people's minds or attitudes or even their day-to-day life practices. But you'd have to be pretty convincing to change someone's ways. Even more challenging than getting someone to eat healthier or try a different workout routine would be to change a core belief, value, or attitude system. So let's take a look now at reinforcing. Reinforcing someone's existing beliefs or actions, behaviors, or routine sounds a little more simple. If I already work out 5 days a week, then convincing me that what I'm doing is good, right, or that I should just keep doing it doesn't sound too hard. Still, it's important to remember that we, as a society, seek out affirming and reinforcing messages all the time. These types of messages help us sustain our belief systems and our day-to-day practices, telling us that what we're doing is good. So the task of reinforcing an audience's values, minds, or actions is one that's worthwhile. Also, when the goal is to reinforce us on existing beliefs, it can be assumed that the audience is most likely already on your side. In other words, there won't be too much controversy or disagreement. So as such, these types of audiences provide really valuable feedback to a speaker. Okay, on to the 3 types of persuasive speeches. Now, as I go over these 3, I want you to think about which one you might use for your 3rd speech. The first is an argument or an assertion of fact. In essence, you will be arguing or taking a position on whether something is true or not true, happened or did not happen, if something exists or does not exist. We can think of these in an objective way. One of the greatest examples I have from a former student was a speech he gave about whether or not human beings have ever in fact landed on the moon. He argued that despite all the evidence pointing to the fact that we had in fact landed on the moon, that it is false, and we have not. Some people in class labeled him more of a conspiracy theorist, but conspiracy theories actually work well for this type of speech. Again, your goal is to convince the audience using various persuasive speaking strategies about whether or not there is a truth in a matter or falsehood. Let's now move on to the next speech type. This is an argument or an assertion of value. Rather than proving whether something is true or false, this style of speech adopts more of a subjective tone, as you take a position on a side of an issue, one that is of value. In other words, whether something is right or wrong, good or bad for us, worthy of our time or not worth our time, whether something is fair or perhaps unjust, whether you see an issue as important or irrelevant. Let me provide another example from a former student. They argued that no level of dishonesty belongs in a romantic relationship, period. How is that controversial? Well, let's say, for example, that you are planning a surprise party and your significant other asks you what you've been up to. Do you tell them? Because you believe in honesty at all points? Or do you withhold that information, maybe instead spreading a white lie that you've been busy after work? What other contexts can you think of where dishonesty might be okay in a romantic relationship? Or perhaps you're on the side that says it doesn't. In any case, you can see that there are clearly two sides of this issue and a lot of different contexts and examples that we could bring up as support from one side or the other. Do a moment of brainstorming and write down some of your values, things that you believe are right or good for us, things that you believe are wrong or bad for us, where we should spend our time or money, things that you believe are fair, or maybe make a short list of injustices. Now let's move on to the third type. The third type of persuasive speech is an argument or assertion of policy. I want you to think about this in this way. Could you argue that things should happen in a particular way? That they should proceed in a particular way? That there's legislation that needs to be passed, or legislation that should definitely not be passed? Are there rules, standards of conduct, codes, policies that you would like to see changed, adapted, shifted, or modernized? Arguments of policy encourage action on behalf of the audience member, not only to take and pick a side, but maybe even to vote, or petition, or advocate for one side or another. Here's another example from a former student. This speaker took the position that drivers over the age of 70 should have to take a mandatory driving test, no matter their skill or ability level. Another example is from a student who argued that everyone should have to take a parenting class if they would like to family plan, and prior to becoming a parent. Now, I'm sure you can think of many reasons why this would be beneficial, but others might say, I shouldn't have to take a parenting class. What if that parenting class doesn't align with my cultural values? A third example we could talk about would be book prices. Should students have to pay for extra materials in a college class above and beyond the registration fees? Should there be a cap on textbook prices? These are some of the topics that students have used in the past that lend themselves to an argument or assertion of policy. Next, I'd like to introduce you to some persuasive speech organizational tools. The first thing to think about when planning and developing your speech is the ways in which a persuasive speech lends itself to a problem solution or cause-effect format. Now, for this speech, you might very well continue to use the introduction, 3-point, body, and conclusion format. But as you do, think about the ways that the main points could be set up in order to create a problem or showcase a problem to the audience, and then how you might use one of those main points to provide us a solution. In the cause-effect model, students have often adopted a 3-main point body of the speech, such that main point 1 addresses the causes that led up to their problem or issue at hand. Main point 2 discusses the current state of the issue or problem. And then main point 3 talks about the effects, either as measured or potential effects for the future. Now, these look very similar and certainly can be applied in very similar ways. So I suggest you take a look at your chapter on persuasive speaking in order to understand even more about how these formats can help you prepare for your speech. For your third speech, it's important that you choose a debatable issue, one that's controversial, something that a reasonable person could argue for or against. In fact, in previous classes, I've even had students ask to partner for this speech, where one student argues for a cause and one against it. If that's something you're interested in doing, please have both you and your partner email me for further instructions. Next, as you plan your speech, think about whether your goal is to create, change, or reinforce, and whether your call to action is going to be one aimed at changing, creating, or reinforcing an existing belief or a specific behavior. So go ahead, take a minute and brainstorm just a few of your ideas, and then email me with any questions. Okay, so part 2 of this week covers a discussion on morals and ethics, really focusing on ethics in public speaking and what it means to be an ethical listener. So first, let's start by thinking about the ways in which morals and ethics are the same. Also, how they are different. It's important to consider why we would even be having a conversation about morals or ethics in a public speaking class. So let's dive in and start with some definitions. As noted from Dr. Perez from Houston Community College, ethics is the moral principle that governs a person's behavior or conduct surrounding an activity. Morals, on the other hand, are concerned with the principles of right and wrong and the goodness or badness of human character. Well, those are very different from our law, for example, or a system of rules that a particular country or community recognizes as regulating these actions, the actions of its members, based on the rightness or wrongness as determined by the society. So let's pause there. Morals are often dictated by society, and we can imagine the ways that morals may vary from culture to culture, generation to generation. How you discern right from wrong might be very different from how your parents or caregivers discern right from wrong. Also, if we were to travel abroad, we might find some customs in particular to be accepted in society more so than they would in the United States. Ethics, on the other hand, are far more personal. They involve individuals making decisions about right or wrong when presented with a particular dilemma. So here's an example of an ethical situation. Imagine that you have a very close friend or a relative coming in for an interview and you are the interviewer. Without even asking a single question, you already know that you want to hire your friend. Is this act unethical? Many would argue yes. It would be unethical to simply hire a friend before conducting a proper interview because the selection process during job hiring should be transparent and unbiased. Here's another example. I've often asked my students if any dishonesty is okay in a romantic relationship. Well, morally, some might say that it's wrong to be dishonest in a relationship. Others might say, well, it depends on the situation. What if you're throwing a surprise party and your significant other asks you what you've been up to or why you've been out late? Well, that would be an example from the morals of discerning right from wrong, from the ethics, making a decision about what's right or wrong in a particular scenario or moment. So you see, ethics pits two possible, potentially good outcomes against one another and requires that a decision be made. There's further explanation on the differences between morals and ethics in a link found this week under our course announcements. Feel free to take a look. So, why are we talking about ethics in the context of public speaking? Well, I want you to think about what it would mean to be an ethical speaker. Making decisions about the rightness or wrongness of a particular topic, for example, or participation technique as you're planning your speech. Well, two of the most important ethical commitments, as talked about in your text, are honesty, which includes avoiding plagiarism, and setting responsible goals as a public speaker. What does it mean to be an honest speaker? Well, it's important as a speaker that you always tell your audience the truth. If you want them to accept what you're saying at face value, then it's important that what you say is credible and has merit. As you cite statistics, for example, you want to make sure to cite your sources and be sure that you know how and when to orally cite information in your speech that you've borrowed or researched. In this class, we'll be using the rule of 2 identifiers. Perhaps we've already mentioned this before, but let me reiterate. Imagine, for example, that you are using an article that you found from Time magazine in 2016, written about global warming. Now, when citing that speech or when citing that research orally in your speech, you're going to want to give the audience 2 identifiers. In other words, 2 ways that they could identify the source where you gathered the information. There are 4 possible identifiers that you can choose from. First, you can mention the author's last name. Second, the year that the research was published. For a website, this will always be the copyright date at the bottom of a page. Third, you could mention the name of the source itself. In our example, it would be Time magazine. And fourth, you could offer the title of either the article, the book, or the chapter where you retrieved the information. Among those 4 identifiers, author last name, date, source, and title, your job is to select 2 and to use those anytime that you are quoting or paraphrasing information in your speech that you received from an outside source. If you have questions about this, please be sure to email me. The second part of being an ethical speaker is to set responsible goals. As you plan your speech and taking an audience-centered approach, it's important that we value diversity. And in a persuasive speech, such as the one you'll be doing in just a few weeks, it's important that you work to raise social awareness. In doing so, make sure to prepare your speech using inclusive rather than exclusive language. You might want to go back and revisit the discussion on mindful and inclusive language choices. This includes both your topic selection and your word choice. Now, many students have asked whether or not I limit or restrict certain topics during a persuasive speech. And my answer has always been no, I don't. However, it is important that we're sensitive to the different cultural differences, diversity values, political standpoints, and identities of those in this class. For example, one time I had a student who was really committed to giving a passionate speech about raising awareness around suicide. What she didn't know is another student in the class had recently lost a loved one to suicide, and that functioned as a trigger for her. It was really hard for that student to listen to the speech and give proper feedback. Now, I'm not sure that the speaker could have known that this was the case. But I am going to suggest that because this is not a Toastmasters or professional public speaking class, but rather a workshop, one where we're learning how to be stronger, better prepared, and ethical speakers, that maybe you choose something that isn't as heated or controversial as something like assisted suicide. Now, again, that's not to say the controversial topics, like gun control, for example, another student fave, aren't important, especially today. But I do want to make sure that we are being ethical speakers and committed to inclusive language, mindful choices, and raising social awareness during this important time. In this class, you're not only going to be giving speeches, but listening to them as well. So far, I've posted several links to outside sources from professional and student speakers, some of which may have even contained content that you disagreed with or found challenging to listen to. Here's where an important part of listening comes in: the ethics. Now, Chapter 3 is an excellent resource that provides far more information and definitional features of ethical listening. But for now, I want you to think about yourself as an audience member and how it is that you can provide ethical feedback to a speaker. What does ethical feedback look like? Nodding along or smiling? Good posture or asking questions? What might unethical listening look like? Can you think of some other situations or circumstances where you might need to exercise ethical listening? Ethical listening, more or less, means mindful listening, being open-minded, remembering, for example, that morals vary from culture to culture, and valuing the diverse opinions, attitudes, and beliefs of others around you. I don't know about you, but when I'm challenged by a speaker's content, there's a tendency for me to shut down, to begin judging or making assumptions about the content, or, at worst, even the speaker. Now, I'm not perfect, and I don't expect you to be either, but that's a good moment to pause and reflect on ethical listening. In what ways can we still remain open-minded, even when listening to content that we're challenged by? To do so, I want us to think about our ethical standards and self-reflect on some of our own morals. So first, start by listing some of your morals on a piece of paper. Things that you believe are good, bad, right, or wrong. Turning back to the last slide, for example, you could even answer whether or not it's appropriate to have any level of dishonesty in a romantic relationship, and the context in which you might make exceptions. After you list some of your morals, I want you to think about the sources from which your ethical behaviors originated. Who or what influenced your ethics? Was it your parents? Something you studied? Maybe a teacher or coach or mentor? Maybe even a life experience that taught you a valuable lesson. For some additional practice, I want you to consider the following 3 ethical scenarios. We will be using these this week on your discussion board. Choose one. Either A, imagine that you attend a political debate on campus, and the candidate's speech contains many ideas that you don't agree with. How could you be an ethical listener during their speech? Again, Chapter 3 would be a great resource to help you answer this question. Or B, you're preparing to give a speech on a topic and you realize that you've lost the citation information for one of the important sources. You just can't seem to find your source again. So what would you do to ethically prepare for the speech? And C, when practicing your speech on an influential sports figure, you realize that you refer to the audience, your co-ed classmates, quite often as you guys. Is this an ethical language choice? As an ethical speaker, what changes might you make? Thank you for listening, and this wraps up Week 9 on persuasion and ethical speaking.